Jesus Freak here. I've had to step in some discussions recently where people weren't aware of the origins of the KJV and misrepresented it. So I felt I had to correct the record. Most of this is probably pretty well known in more scholarly circles, but a common meme among the laity is that the KJV was the first English translation, which it wasn't. I think if there was, there's probably two claims here. The first into any sort of English would probably be, as far as complete Bibles go, that of John Wycliffe and his associates at the end of the 14th century. This was into Middle English, not what we call English today, but at least recognizably close to it, that with some difficulty you could probably make out most of the words. This was translated from Latin, because it's all that they had at the time. John Wycliffe was a sort of antecedent of Protestantism, and as a result, in 1428, the Church of Rome desecrated his grave. Several people who were familiar with his writings developed his beliefs further. Jan Hus, probably the best known of these. Wycliffe was called the Morning Star of the Reformation because a lot of his beliefs were sort of prototypical of what you'd see later in Protestantism. The first translation into what would be called modern English gets a bit complicated. William Tyndale was attempting for some time to do a translation of the New Testament based on the work of Erasmus. Erasmus was a Catholic to the end, but he did produce, and there was a bit of a rush to produce it. He was competing with a guy, I think his name was Zuniga in Spain, who was also trying to produce the first printed Greek New Testament. But because Zuniga was held up a bit, Erasmus managed to get his out first. It was a rush job, and he admitted as such, releasing pretty soon after a second edition that revised some of the blunders. He was missing the last few verses of Revelation and back translated these from Latin. Now, William Tyndale managed to finish his New Testament in 1526, and it was, I believe, printed in Belgium because he was in exile. Because he had made a lot of enemies in high places in England. And he was on the run while he was trying to get the New Testament printed. An early attempt, I believe it was in Worms, to get it printed, failed when the printer was caught, and and Tyndale had to flee the city. In 1530, he published the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and sometime after that, he published a translation of the book of Jonah. He published a revision of the New Testament in 1534 as a response to someone who was pirating his translation and changing a few things in it and giving him credit, which annoyed him. I believe his name was George Joy. Anyway, he continued to work on the Old Testament even after the church authorities had him arrested and imprisoned in Belgium. But he didn't finish by the time he died. One of his associates, Miles Coverdale, used what he had published during his lifetime and translated the rest from a mix of German and Latin. And got it out in 1537, the year after Tyndale died. Another of his associates, John Rogers, under a false name, produced another complete Bible, which was a revision of Coverdale, and he had some of Tyndale's manuscripts covering up to the end of 2nd Chronicles, which is a little less than half of the Old Testament. Now, after this was Henry VIII's infamous situation where he got thrown out of the church for deciding he wanted a divorce and started his own church. Initially, he didn't want to change too much, but he decided to get in league with the reformers to set his church apart from the Church of Rome, and licensed the Matthew's Bible, although he eventually set Miles Coverdale to work on a revision of it, which became known as the Great Bible because it was great in the sense of it was huge. There were a few other revisions of these translations going on at the same time. Coverdale produced another translation of the New Testament directly from Latin in order to show that it was possible to do an accurate translation in English. And then eventually, when Queen Mary got to the throne, she was a hardcore Catholic. She wanted to bring England back to Rome, and she had John Rogers executed. He was her first execution, burned at the stake. And a number of people, including Miles Coverdale, fled the British Isles and set up shop in Geneva. And in 1557, they produced a revision of the New Testament. They finished off the Old Testament and published it in 1560. A further revision of the New Testament was published in 1576 by Lawrence Thompson. These are collectively known as the Geneva Bible. This would be considered the first complete translation to English directly or purportedly directly from the original languages. Meanwhile, the Church of Rome decided, well, as long as people are going to have a translation into English, we'll give them one that we approve of. But what they produced was a really obscurantist translation that was barely English at all. They published the New Testament at Reims in, I believe it was 1582, and the King James translators did avail themselves of this. They published the Old Testament in 1609. Meanwhile, the Queen died and Elizabeth I took the throne, and she had another translation produced, which was a revision of the Great Bible. I believe this was an even bigger copy, and it did occasionally make reference to the Geneva. It was called the Bishop's Bible because it was produced by the bishops. It wasn't a very competent translation. Now, this translation came out, I believe, in 1568. There was a revision done, I want to say 1602. And this was the official Bible of the Church of England. Most people who had Bibles in English would have been the Geneva. The Psalter of the Great Bible was preferred too, and often replaced the Bishop's translation. The Book of Common Prayer had, until very recently, kept this translation of the Psalms. Meanwhile, James VI of Scotland acceded to the throne of England as James I in 1604, and after some conversations decided to put forth a new translation, not necessarily because of any issues with the earlier translations, but first because the Bishop's Bible and the Geneva Bible were duking it out for dominance, and he wanted one single version. Also, it would benefit him politically. Also, the issue with the Geneva Bible was basically an early study Bible, and it had a lot of annotations in it. Some of these notations were pretty controversial, and for this reason, James I insisted that the only notes that be in the Bible would be notes regarding potential issues with the translation. Stuff that couldn't necessarily be rendered clearly into English, or where there was some question as to how best to translate it. So this was published in 1611. Now, it still had to fight with the Geneva Bible for decades. When the Puritans came over in 1620 and 1621, they didn't bring over the KJV, they brought over the Geneva Bible. It was the Geneva Bible that came over on the Mayflower. And of course, the Puritans eventually took over the English throne. Oliver Cromwell was the king in all but name. When the former royal family managed to retake the throne, they finally completely banned the Geneva Bible and had it squelched. This is the actual reason why the King James Version managed to survive as long as it did. Because the competition was squelched. Anyway, I figured I had to clear up a few things. And I hope that does. Jesus, freak out.